In the waning days of 1967, the American populace was assured that the end of a grueling overseas conflict was finally within reach. The highest echelons of military leadership confidently declared that the enemy was exhausted, their ranks depleted, and their will to fight steadily eroding under the relentless pressure of superior firepower. Citizens sitting in their living rooms were fed a steady diet of optimistic progress reports, creating an illusion of imminent victory in a distant jungle. But beneath this veneer of inevitable triumph, a meticulously coordinated storm was gathering in the shadows, preparing to shatter the status quo, fracture U.S. public opinion, and irrevocably alter the relationship between a government and its people. This was the crucible of the Vietnam War, a defining struggle of the broader Cold War era. At its core, the Cold War was a decades-long geopolitical standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, fought not through direct confrontation, but through proxy wars in developing nations. In Vietnam, American forces were deployed to prevent the spread of communism, relying heavily on a doctrine of attrition. The strategy of attrition dictates that victory is achieved not necessarily by capturing territory, but by inflicting such massive casualties that the enemy is physically and psychologically ground down until they can no longer sustain the fight. Yet the architects of the North Vietnamese war effort, primarily Le Duan and General Vo Nguyen Giap, understood that they could never defeat the American military in a conventional war of attrition. Facing mounting losses and desperate to break the agonizing stalemate, they conceived a breathtakingly audacious gamble. They would launch a massive, synchronized surprise attack across dozens of cities and military installations in South Vietnam simultaneously. The objective was not merely tactical territory, but a grand strategic shock designed to spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese populace and shatter the political will of their superpower adversary. The storm broke at the end of January 1968, precisely during the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet. Traditionally a time of ceasefire and celebration, the holiday provided the perfect cover for the infiltration of tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regular troops into urban centers previously considered secure. When the coordinated Tet Offensive commenced, the sheer scale and ferocity of the assaults caught American and South Vietnamese forces completely off guard. The battlefield suddenly shifted from remote jungle canopies to the sprawling, densely populated streets of major provincial capitals. Nowhere was this shock more visceral than in the capital city of Saigon, where a specialized Viet Cong sapper unit breached the outer walls of the United States Embassy. For several agonizing hours, a desperate firefight raged on the very grounds of the most potent symbol of American power and diplomatic immunity in the region. Although the attackers were ultimately repelled and eliminated, the tactical reality of the skirmish was entirely eclipsed by its symbolic devastation. The fortress had been pierced, and the illusion of absolute security was violently dismantled. The reverberations of the embassy assault and the broader nationwide offensive were instantaneously transmitted across the globe. For the first time in human history, the raw, chaotic, and brutal realities of urban combat were broadcast almost directly into the homes of millions of civilians via uncensored TV news. Viewers were subjected to visceral images of desperate street-fighting summary executions and widespread destruction unvarnished by military public relations officers. The sanitized narrative of a controlled, steadily progressing campaign evaporated overnight. This sudden influx of violent imagery created a catastrophic credibility gap for the American government. The public was abruptly forced to reconcile the optimistic official declarations of a weakened enemy with the undeniable visual evidence of a highly capable, fiercely determined adversary mounting a nationwide offensive. If the enemy was truly on the verge of collapse, how could they orchestrate such a massive, coordinated strike against the most heavily defended installations in the country? Trust in official assessments fractured, replaced by a profound and pervasive skepticism regarding the true state of the war. From a strictly military perspective, the offensive was an unmitigated disaster for the communist forces. The anticipated popular uprising among the South Vietnamese civilians never materialized, and American and Allied troops rapidly reorganized, unleashing devastating counterattacks that decimated the Viet Cong infrastructure. The attackers suffered horrific casualties, losing tens of thousands of experienced fighters and failing to hold any major urban centers. By all traditional metrics of warfare, the United States had achieved a decisive, crushing tactical victory on the battlefield. How then did a catastrophic military defeat for the North Vietnamese translate into one of the most profound strategic victories of the 20th century? The answer lies in the fundamental nature of asymmetric conflict, where the true center of gravity is not the enemy's army, but the political resolve of their home front. The architects in Hanoi had correctly calculated that the American public possessed a finite tolerance for a protracted bloody conflict with no clear endgame in sight. By demonstrating their capacity to strike anywhere at any time, they targeted the American mind, bypassing the impenetrable strength of the American military. This realization underscored the terrifying efficacy of guerrilla warfare when paired with psychological strategy. Guerrilla warfare relies on mobility, ambush, and sabotage by smaller, unconventional units against a larger, less mobile traditional army. However, in this instance, the guerrilla tactics were scaled up to a conventional level for a brief, spectacular moment. Not to win the ground, but to win the narrative. The enemy proved they possess an unbreakable will to endure punishment, signaling to the American public that the war could grind on indefinitely, demanding an ever-increasing toll in blood and treasure. The psychological shockwaves rapidly destabilized the highest levels of American military command. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, submitted a deeply controversial request for an additional 206,000 troops to capitalize on the enemy's tactical losses. When this massive troop request was leaked to the press, it confirmed the public's worst fears. It signaled not a war winding down, but a massive, terrifying escalation of a conflict that the government had just claimed was nearly won. The weight of this strategic paradox fell squarely on the shoulders of President Lyndon B. Johnson, a seasoned political operator who had envisioned a legacy defined by sweeping domestic social reforms. Johnson now found himself consumed by a deeply unpopular overseas conflict. The relentless protests outside the White House, the plummeting approval ratings, and the fracturing of his own political party created an atmosphere of intense isolation and despair. The war had become an inescapable quagmire, slowly draining his political capital and his personal resolve. The breaking point arrived on March 31st, 1968. In a stunning nationally televised address that shocked the political establishment and the world, President Johnson announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and called for peace negotiations. But it was his closing statement that truly shifted the era. With a somber demeanor, he declared to a captive nation that he would neither seek nor accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. The commander-in-chief had effectively been deposed not by a military coup, but by the collapse of public consensus. Johnson's abdication signaled a tectonic shift in American foreign policy and the global Cold War dynamic. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the limits of American superpower intervention were starkly exposed. The assumption that overwhelming economic and military superiority could automatically dictate the political destiny of a developing nation was shattered. Allies and adversaries alike recalibrated their geopolitical strategies, recognizing that the United States was vulnerable not to foreign invasion, but to internal political exhaustion. Domestically, the aftermath of the offensive catalyzed a profound societal upheaval. The anti-war movement, previously marginalized as a radical fringe, surged into the mainstream consciousness, drawing millions of disillusioned citizens into the streets. Campuses erupted in protest, cities burned with racial and political tension, and the generational divide widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The year 1968 became synonymous with domestic turbulence, a period where the very fabric of American society seemed to be unraveling under the immense pressure of the overseas conflict. This domestic crisis forced a fundamental reevaluation of military strategy, culminating in the doctrine of Vietnamization introduced by the subsequent Nixon administration. Vietnamization was a calculated policy designed to gradually shift the primary burden of ground combat from American troops to the South Vietnamese military. By slowly withdrawing American forces while simultaneously increasing training and logistical support for their allies, the new administration sought to pacify the anti-war movement at home while attempting to maintain a non-communist government in Saigon. The implementation of this new doctrine marked the beginning of a slow, agonizing withdrawal that would drag on for several more years. The echoes of that jungle conflict still resonated, serving as a grim testament to the fact that military supremacy cannot overcome a lack of clear, achievable political objectives. The massive deployment of troops, the relentless bombing campaigns, and the staggering loss of life had ultimately failed to secure the primary strategic goal, leaving a fractured nation to grapple with the profound moral and strategic failures of the intervention. One must consider the terrifying fragility of historical narratives when exploring these events. What if the TV cameras had not been present to capture the chaotic assault on the embassy? If the public had only received the sanitized, delayed reports from military command, would they have accepted the government's declaration of a decisive tactical victory? The intense media coverage of the Tet Offensive permanently altered the relationship between the military and the press, ensuring that future conflicts would be heavily managed, censored, and sanitized to prevent a similar collapse of public morale. The strategic lessons from that decisive campaign never faded from the halls of power. The resulting political trauma birthed what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a pervasive public skepticism and legislative reluctance to commit military forces to overseas conflicts without overwhelming national interest and clear exit strategies. For decades, the shadow of the Tet Offensive dictated the parameters of American military engagement, forcing policymakers to constantly weigh the tactical benefits of intervention against the terrifying risk of domestic political backlash. Beyond military doctrine, the most enduring legacy of the offensive was a permanent fracture in the American public's trust toward government institutions. The stark realization that highest officials had systematically misled the public about the progress and viability of the war shattered a long-held civic innocence. This deep-seated cynicism towards state narratives and official pronouncements became a defining characteristic of the modern political landscape, forever altering the way citizens consume information and interact with their leaders. Ultimately, the events of early 1968 stand as the ultimate historical lesson in the brutal realities of asymmetric warfare. It demonstrated with devastating clarity that the victor in a modern conflict is not always the combatant who controls the physical battlefield or inflicts the most casualties. Rather, the true victor is the one who can successfully identify, target, and shatter the enemy's political will to continue the fight. By weaponizing the psychological impact of a massive synchronized assault, a militarily inferior force achieved a strategic masterpiece. The Tet Offensive remains a monumental paradox, a crushing tactical defeat that miraculously morphed into a decisive war-altering victory. It was the precise moment the illusion of inevitable American triumph was pierced, forcing a superpower to confront the agonizing limits of its own strength. By breaking the consensus of the public and the spirit of a presidency, this sudden explosion of violence in a distant land fundamentally redirected the trajectory of global diplomacy and domestic politics, proving once again how a single audacious military gamble can ensure that eras shifted forever.